Okay, also, a quick reminder, that activity we did on Friday is due tomorrow at 8:30. Right, so make sure you have that done and submitted. Okay, you can obviously submit it early. If it's done, you can just submit it. Okay, and I might even get a chance to look at it today. We'll see. All right, so for today, we're going over transport in multicellular organisms, plants in particular, because that's what our lab on Friday is going to be about. Okay, how do plants transport materials from place to place? Okay, so we'll be looking at that. Obviously, some of the cell transport stuff that we talked about, especially diffusion and osmosis, in particular osmosis, are going to be a big part of this. Right? They still obviously are cell transport processes, but can also be used to help out over larger distances. Okay. So we're going to look at how transport within cells is similar and involved in transport in a multicellular organism. Okay, again, osmosis is going to be a big one there. Understand how nutrients, that would be water, sugar, and minerals, are transported in vascular plants. Okay, what does vascular mean? You have a cardiovascular system in your body. Vascular plants have something like what you have. How does blood get around your body? How is it transported in? Veins. Okay? That's why it's called your cardiovascular system. Vascular means tubes. Okay? It has tubes. So, vascular plant has tubes. Okay? You've seen in a leaf that a leaf has veins. Right? Well, that's the vascular tissue of a plant. Okay? And it is within the vascular tissue that we are going to be concerned with the transport of materials. Okay? So vascular plants have tubes. A moss is not a vascular plant. Okay? It does not have any tubes. It does not have a cuticle. Okay? That's why it dries up so quickly and never gets tall. That's why you never see a 30-foot moss. Okay? They just can't do that. They have to stay close to the ground. They can't support themselves. They can't transport materials to high heights. Okay? Things like that. Whereas a giant sequoia, like you would see growing in Lake Vancouver, that is definitely a vascular plant. Okay? It has tubes that it uses to transport material to the tops of the tree. All right, and then learn what forces are involved in that transport. So that's what we'll be looking at today. There's always lots of stuff about or from this lesson on the unit exam, and obviously for the analysis part of your lab that we'll be starting on Friday. Okay, so the issue for a plant, or the challenge for a plant, is that the resources they need are spatially separated. That means they are not located in the same place. Water and nutrients are in the dirt. Light is not. Okay, so it has to have differentiation or specialization, like we talked about yesterday, that allows it to acquire and transport not only the raw materials, but also the products of all the stuff that goes on in the plant. Okay, so do roots carry out much photosynthesis? No. Last time I checked, there's no light underground, so they don't carry out any photosynthesis. They may have some chloroplasts in their cells simply because they're plant cells, but not very many, and they don't do anything. Unless it's a potato that's gotten like kind of close to the surface. Anyone ever seen like you peel a potato and you know it's been near the surface because it's a little bit green. Okay, so if you ever have a potato and a little part of it is a little bit green, it just means it got near enough to the surface, okay, that it started carrying out some photosynthesis. Incidentally, you should not eat that part of the potato. Okay, don't eat green parts of the potato. The rest of the plant obviously can't acquire water because it's got a waxy cuticle covering it and it's not going to penetrate. So the rest of the plant's job is carry out photosynthesis or support the plant so it can carry out photosynthesis, but it can't get water for itself. Okay? So these two things have to work together. The roots need sugar, but can't make it themselves. The leaves need water, but can't get it themselves. And so there has to be a system of tubes that transport those materials up and down. Here's the challenge. They have to transport different materials in different directions. Can you use the same tubes for that? I wouldn't. That's like putting a northbound train and a southbound train on the same track. Okay? It's not going to end well. Okay? You cannot transport different materials in the same tube in different directions. Okay? It just won't work. So a plant actually has to have different sets of tubes depending on what type of material is being transferred. Okay, so the body of a vascular plant is differentiated into the subterranean, that means underground, root system, okay, that absorbs water and minerals, and an aerial shoot system, so that includes the stem and the leaves and the flowers and all of that, okay, that make food. All right, so those two parts of the plant have to work together to ensure the plant's survival. Plants have evolved many different ways of doing that. Okay, how many people have raspberries at home? Like raspberry plants, not raspberries in the fridge. Okay. You ever notice what happens with raspberry plants? They crawl. They grow everywhere. If you have a few, you're going to have a lot, and you're going to have them everywhere, okay? Because they can crawl. Strawberries will do the same thing. Okay? They put out what's called a stolon, which is just a little tube. It's like a pipeline, okay? And it'll go over to another place. And if it can set down and there's water and nutrients in that place, a new piece of plant will grow over there, and it will be connected to the original plant by a pipeline. Okay? The stolon that can transport material back and forth between the two spots. So it's kind of what a plant does if part of it's gotten pretty mature and is simply out pacing its resources in that area. It can just run a little stolon over to another place, okay, and start another plant over there. Okay? So we see that with certain types of plants. Okay? Some plants will store energy. They can produce more energy than they require for their own growth and their own needs. Okay? So what they'll do is they'll store energy in their root system, okay, as either a rhizome or as a tuber. Okay? A potato is a tuber. Cassava is more of a rhizome. Okay? They're both starchy foods, okay, because they are energy storage units for a plant. Okay? That's why there's so much food energy in potatoes. That's plant fat, really, okay, is what it is. So if we have excess energy as an animal, we store it as fat. If a plant has excess energy, it stores it as either long sugars or starch. Okay? So potatoes and cassava, okay, are starchy materials that are energy storage. Okay, does that sort of make sense? Okay. Now, what's the advantage of a potato for a plant? Not only is it energy storage, but what else can it do?
Create more.
Yeah, it can create more plants. Okay, it's an asexual form of reproduction for the plant called vegetative propagation. I don't know if you learned that in grade 9, something you should have learned in grade 9, but if you, in the springtime, next year, in the springtime, there'll be boxes of seed potatoes for sale in lots of places. Okay? And all you do, just like Mark Watney in The Martian, is you cut them in half and stick them in the ground, and they'll grow. You don't have to put poop with them. Okay? I will put that caveat on there. You don't have to be entirely like Mark Watney. Okay? He had to put poop in with his because there was no bacteria to help the soil on Mars. So he used the bacteria from his crewmate's poop, which was disgusting, but he had to do it to live and not think about the fact that he grew them all of his own poop and other people's poop. Let's get off that topic because it's kind of gross. Okay, but yeah, that's vegetative propagation. You can actually grow another plant from those potatoes, and the reason you can do that is because there's enough energy stored in that potato to get the plant started. Okay, has anyone ever had a potato that's kind of gone bad? They left it and it kind of got in the back of the pantry and forgot about it. Anyone ever notice what it does?
Grows these hairs.
Yeah, it grows sprouts. Okay, and depending on the size of the potato, it can grow a lot of them before it runs out of food energy. Okay, I once had some in my basement that I forgot about, and I came down one day to this like smell of like rotting food. Okay, and I was like, oh man, what is down here? And then I found this like mass. It looked like a giant spider, okay, with long purple legs. Okay, and in the middle of the spider was this what remained of the potato, that was the rotten part. It had just turned into this gooey black mess, okay? But from it were these long sprouts, and they all had little tiny purple leaves on them. It was just trying to grow somewhere where it could get light, so it could carry out photosynthesis and make a new plant. So I had these like, essentially, kind of fetal potato plants that just never got the ability to go because it didn't get to any light and there was nowhere for them to put down roots. But they exhausted all the energy in the potato, okay, before they quit. Okay, does that sort of make sense? Okay, so that's what those plants do. Okay, that's why we can get so much food energy out of a potato, because that's exactly what it's for. Onions, similar. Okay, instead of storing the food energy as starch, they store it as long sugars, which is why onions are sweet and potatoes are bitter. Okay? Starches tend to be bitter tasting, whereas long chain sugars, which is what you have in an onion, taste sweet. Okay? They're both storing energy. Okay? And can you grow an onion from an old onion? Yeah. Okay? If you get onion bulbs, okay, you're basically getting onions that they pulled and dried, and you just plant them the next year and they'll grow from the bulb. Okay? You don't actually have to plant them from a seed. All right. Okay, so other adaptations of vascular plants, and this one is really important because it's what allows vascular plants to compete for light, right? I know that kind of sounds weird to use the word compete when you're talking about a plant, because there's no like plant Olympics or anything like that, okay? But they are competing for resources. They grow their roots a little bit deeper or a little bit farther to compete for water. They grow a little bit taller and try and shade out other plants to compete for light. Okay? So in order to grow tall, you either have to have a fair amount of like strong cell walls, or you have to have something that can make the cell walls even harder to support a lot of weight. Okay? That material is a protein called lignin. Okay? Lignin is what makes a plant's stem wood-like. Okay? So these plants here at the front have very little lignin. Their stems are green. Okay? There's not much to them. And these plants don't get very tall. Okay? That's about as tall as they would get, maybe another 6 to 12 inches taller than they currently are. They can't get any taller than that because they get too heavy. And without lignin, the cell walls and water vacuoles are simply not strong enough to support that weight, and it'll just bend over. Okay? But if a plant wants to get even taller than that, it's got to find a way to make the stem stronger, stiffer, harder, okay, so that it doesn't break or doesn't fold over. All right? Now, does it want it to be so hard that it's completely rigid? Are plants like super rigid, or are they somewhat flexible, even if they're like a woody tree? You ever see what a tree does in the wind? It sways. So wood's still flexible. Okay, this the stuff that lignin produces is still somewhat flexible. Watch a palm tree in a hurricane. Okay? Those things can bend almost all the way over, okay, and then snap right back over, and then they, like that, okay, back and forth. Okay? Even though they're quite strong and that lignin makes them able to support their weight, they're also still flexible. Okay? So what lignin is it's like cement. Okay? I don't know if anyone's ever laid bricks, but I mean, you can look at the back wall. Okay? You can see that it's made out of cinder blocks. When they make a brick wall or a cinder block wall, okay, they put the bricks down and then they put mortar or cement in the holes and on the top. Okay? And then they put the next brick on. And what does the cement do inside? After a while, cement gets hard, it cures, and then it sticks those two things together. So in the gaps that you see in between these bricks, okay, so these gaps right here, these are filled with mortar, cement. Okay? And when that cement hardens, they cease to be individual blocks and become one solid unit. Well, that's what lignin does. Lignin takes cell walls, so if I've got this plant cell here, and another plant cell, let's say, right underneath it, okay, lignin will go into the cell walls and harden the cell walls together. Okay, you might have another cell right here, okay, and it'll be just like bricks, and they'll cement themselves together with this lignin. The advantage that lignin has over cement is when it's like cured, it's still somewhat flexible. Okay, that's why wood is still somewhat flexible, and why a tree can flex, okay, in the wind. All right, does that make sense to everyone? All right, so lignin allows plants to essentially make wood, okay, or make their stems really strong, as opposed to just relying on turgor pressure, okay, from the water vacuoles. Okay, so turgor pressure is the other thing that a plant can do to support itself. Okay, so that's the pressure of water in the water vacuole. Okay, it contributes to the support of small plants, but it is the skeleton of lignified walls that holds up a tree or other large vascular plant. Okay, so pre-COVID, I had a lot more plants in here, and then during COVID, they told me I had to kill them all, because apparently they can hold stuff. I don't know, I think I totally get rid of them. So these were some of my plants, okay? I'm ashamed to say they often look like this. What do they not have? What have I not done to these plants? I haven't watered them. This is what they look like when I come back at the end of August. Because, you know, June 30th hits and I take off, I'm out of here. Okay, I'm not coming back until the end of August when I have to come back. I'm not even coming back to water my poor plants. They are going to suffer, okay, through the entire summer. And any other time I forget to water them, which is basically all the time. So, they end up looking like this a lot. Will they live? They absolutely will. If I water them again, okay, they'll take that water up because there's an osmotic pressure there. There's lots of salts inside the plant. Water will rush into the plant to balance the salt concentrations. It'll fill all their vacuoles because, again, okay, there's going to be an osmotic pressure that's going to pull water in. There's more salt inside the cell than there is outside, so the water will go in to balance it, okay, and they'll fill right back up again. Right? So what you'll end up seeing is if a plant is healthy, okay, the water vacuoles are full and they're pushing everything against the cell wall. As the cell becomes dehydrated, okay, the osmotic pressure starts to pull water out of the cell and out of the water vacuoles. And eventually it gets to a point where the membrane will pull away from the cell wall because there's not enough turgor pressure from inside to push it against the cell wall, and that's when a plant wilts. Okay? The cell wall alone is not enough to support the plant. Okay? If there's turgor pressure, then the plant can be supported. Or if there's lignin, the plant can be supported. Okay? But if the plant doesn't have lignin, this is what will happen as it becomes starved for water. Right? Now, I actually have a video. All right, so it's important to know the term turgor pressure. Okay? It's important to know how it works. Okay, it's the filling, there's the pressure from those water vacuoles being full of water, pushing everything against the cell walls, okay, and keeping the plant upright and rigid so that it can, you know, have its leaves out facing the sun, okay, where they can carry out photosynthesis. All right, so job of the roots. Two jobs of the roots. The roots are there to absorb water and nutrients from the soil and to anchor the plant. To that end, there are actually two kinds of roots. Okay? What are the two kinds of roots? What do we call a root that goes really, really deep? I've never heard of a tap root. A dandelion has a taproot. If you've ever tried to pull out a dandelion, it's got a root like this long on the bottom. Okay, Canada thistle, same thing, it's got a really deep root on it. Okay, one single deep root, like a carrot, okay, or a turnip, okay, parsnip, all of those are all taproots. Okay, the other type of root system is a fibrous root system. Okay? It can go deep, but not generally as deep as a taproot, but its advantage is it can spread out. Okay? So it can go a long way. which root type do you suppose a cactus would have? Yeah, that's generally what people would say, because we picture that, you know, it needs to go really deep because it's got to get to water. But in fact, it's counterintuitive. A saguaro cactus, you know, the one that's like on the top left-hand side, okay, like that, that's got the arms, they actually have a fibrous root system. It doesn't do you any good to go really, really deep into soil that's always dry. There's not going to be any more moisture deeper. Okay? And in fact, usually desert soils are not very, very deep anyway. They just go straight to rock. So they have a fibrous root system that can go up to 50 meters in all directions around the plant. Okay? And it's right at the surface. That way, when it does in fact rain, because you know it's not going to last very long, it can suck up the moisture almost immediately. Okay? Because it's not going to get a chance to absorb for very long before it just dries up. Okay? So they generally have a fibrous root system. Grasses have a fibrous root system. Big trees like a poplar tree or a spruce tree generally have a fibrous root system because they give it a better anchor. Okay? It's anchored to a whole bunch of places so the tree can flex in the wind and move and whatever and not be uprooted. Right? If something has a taproot, so if I had like a really tall spruce tree and it had a taproot and the wind starts blowing it back and forth, it's going to work the root back and forth in the dirt and eventually it's going to just break off or come right out. Okay? That's how you get a carrot out of the ground when you're harvesting them. Okay? Either you put the shovel in and dig them out, or you just grab onto the top and wiggle it back and forth a little bit and it'll come right out. Okay? It's only got that one point where it's anchored, so it's easier to get it out of the ground. Okay? That's why most plants, especially if they're bigger, don't have a taproot. Okay? Smaller plants typically have a taproot. All right, so advantages of taproots. They go deeper and they can store energy. I mean, if you think about which plants we just talked about, carrots, parsnips, turnips, okay, things like that, that's an energy storage device. Okay, so it can store a lot of energy where a fibrous root system can't. A fibrous root system gives you a pretty good surface area and kind of intrusion into the surrounding soil for being anchored and for acquiring water and nutrients. And some plants, especially beans and peas, will have these little nodules on their roots that contain bacteria that can actually take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into forms that the plant can use. Okay? This is typically why farmers will rotate their crops. They won't typically grow the same crop on the same field year after year. And if they cycle through, like they grow, let's say, canola, which takes a lot of nutrients, the next year they'll grow beans or field peas, because those plants will actually put nitrogen back into the soil as opposed to take it out. Okay, canola, that'll take everything out of the soil, and you usually have to put fertilizer like crazy down on it. Okay, but with beans and peas, they'll do that themselves, and they can replenish the soil naturally, which means you get to use less chemicals for your crop. All right, so definitely know the two kinds of root systems, tap and fibrous root. Kind of know the advantages of both. Okay, taproot can go pretty deep. There are some plants whose taproots go deep enough that they'll actually tap groundwater. Okay, so they'll like hit a well or an aquifer. Okay, they can go that deep sometimes, okay, especially if that area has a lot of springs and stuff near the surface. Okay, the stem. So while the stem is often green, especially in smaller plants, photosynthesis is not its primary function. It can carry some out, but it's not its primary function. Its primary function is to support the leafy tissue and direct growth. Okay, so and also to transport materials, because it is within the stem that we find those tubes we were talking about at the beginning of the lesson. Okay, the ones that transport water and sugar and other nutrients. Okay, so the job of the stem, support the plant, transport materials, okay, and to an extent direct growth. Okay, what you see in these two pictures here is what can happen to a plant after it's like eaten. Okay, so if this plant, what they did is they just cut it off right here. Okay, if you cut a plant off, or something, a grazing animal comes along and eats part of it, okay, it'll grow back. what it does is it uses the little buds that are kind of everywhere on the plant, and it grows new tissue from those buds because they contain the stem cells we were talking about the other day that can turn into anything. Right? So that plant will simply grow back. If you want your lawn to look nice and thick, cut it more often. Right? The more you cut it, the more it grows from below. If you've ever gone by the cemetery over on the other side of town, they've got that big hedge that goes all around the cemetery made out of Organisms. Okay? The more you trim a hedge, the thicker it gets. Okay? So when you start out, a hedge like that starts out as a couple of little sticks. Okay? And you just keep, you let them grow, and then you cut them back, and they grow from a little lower. Okay? You let them get a little bit taller, you cut them back, they grow from a little bit lower, and they get thicker and thicker and thicker until they're eventually a hedge. So if you've ever been to a hedge maze, that is the product of years and years worth of pruning, okay, to make that hedge get so thick that it's effectively a wall. Right? If you don't cut those plants back, they'll just grow one straggly little branch, okay, and just get tall. But the more you cut them back, the more they grow from below and get thicker and thicker. Okay? So the stem kind of directs that growth and responds to, well, trauma. Okay? I mean, for this plant, that's trauma, physical trauma. Okay? It's had a piece of it removed, and it's got to grow in response to that. Okay? All right. Are we okay with the role of the stems? All right, and then we have the leaves. Oh, and look at this, another diagram of the layers of the leaf. It's like it's important. Okay? Because it's an example of specialization in a multicellular organism. That's probably the better diagram there. Okay? So leaves have veins. The veins are part of the phloem and xylem, these tubes that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Okay? And of course, they've got all those layers we were talking about. So you got the upper epidermis here that secretes the waxy cuticle. You've got that palisade layer. You don't have to use the word mesophyll, layer is fine. Okay? Where the cells are packed in and they're column or rectangular. Okay? And they carry out all the photosynthesis. Then there's the irregularly shaped cells underneath that make up the spongy layer, and that's where you'll find the veins, okay? Because the veins want to go into the spongy layer where carbon dioxide, water, sugar, okay, oxygen can readily go back and forth easily, okay, where there's not a lot of cells they have to go through, okay? So they'll go into there, and then we have obviously the lower epidermis where the stomates that are made up of the guard cells are, that open and close because of osmotic pressure. Okay? All of those specialized cells we talked about yesterday. Will I put a diagram of a leaf on the test? Yes. Okay? Will I ask you to explain why it's an example of specialization? Will you need to know the parts of it so that you can explain how they're specialized? Is that a big enough hint? All right, now this one here, this is actually a different kind of leaf. This is your typical C3 leaf. Most plants have this. Cacti have a C4 or can leaf. Okay, and it works differently because it helps to conserve water. So the palisade layer and the spongy layers actually wrap around the veins, okay, which is why you typically don't see veins on the outside of fleshy cacti-like plants. Okay? It helps them to conserve water. And their stomates are also constructed differently out of 4 guard cells instead of 2. Okay? So they work a little bit differently. I am never, ever going to show you a picture of that leaf style again, nor are you ever going to have to label it or know what it does. Okay? The C3 leaf is the one we're concerned with. Okay. Everybody good with the role of the leaves? Okay, leaves carry out photosynthesis, okay, and they have all this specialized tissue to facilitate that. All right, so transport within the plant. So you have this diagram in your notes, and you have a numbered list after it. Okay, the numbers on that list correspond to the numbers on this diagram. So we're going to be talking about the steps that a plant goes through and the mechanisms by which those steps happen. So we've already talked about how plants, vascular plants, have these tubes. Are the tubes big, you suppose? Like when you cut down a tree, you ever see tubes? There's no tubes in it, right? Okay. Well, actually there are. They're just microscopic. You don't see them. this is what wood looks like under an electron microscope. Okay? This line right here, okay, is 100 micrometers. So how big are all of the little tubes? Like the biggest tubes there are what? 35, maybe 40 micrometers across. The vast majority of the smaller ones are like 10 or less. Okay? That's because this is where that whole polar nature of water and osmotic pressure happen. If I have really big tubes, then I've got a lot of water that is in the middle of that tube and is only going to be able to rely on cohesion and weak hydrogen bonds to support itself. How well is that going to work out? Not well at all. But if the tubes are really, really tiny, then there's not that much water in each tube, and thus not that much weight in each tube. And the hydrogen bonds, the cohesion and adhesion will be strong enough to support that very, very small column of water, right? So instead of having only a couple really big tubes, the plant has thousands of tiny tubes. We're still talking about the same volume of water being transported in total. It's just being transported in tiny, tiny tubes instead of really big ones. Okay? It's like if you're, if you've ever tried to keep water in a straw, right? So you put it in the liquid, and then you put your thumb over the top and pull it back up. Okay? In a small straw, that works really well. Okay? You can even like shake it a little bit, and the stuff won't come out. But in a bigger straw, it doesn't work nearly as well, because there's a lot of weight of water or liquid in the middle of the straw that's just trying to hold on for dear life by hydrogen bonding to the other water in the area. Because really the only thing the water can hold on to is the inside of the straw. So if you've got a small straw, most of the water can hold on to the straw. If you don't, if you've got a big straw, most of the water is just trying to hold on to other water that's trying to hold on to other water, and then you've got just a few water molecules gripping the outside of the, or the inside of the straw for dear life and trying to hold on, and it just doesn't work. Okay? So these tubes have to be really, really, really small. Okay, so here's how this works. First step is that the roots are going to absorb the water and nutrients from the soil. There's some osmotic pressure involved there, okay, that will help the water move into the plant. Okay? Once the water is in the roots, it will move into the xylem. Okay? And xylem is X-Y-L-E-M. Okay? The xylem is what conducts water. Okay, and it conducts it up the plant using osmotic pressure and the polar nature of water to keep it in place. Okay, that's what the xylem does. So after step number one, we now have, step number three. Step two is just the exchange of gases. So the roots carry out cellular respiration, so they give off CO2, take in oxygen. Okay. Step three is the water moving up the tree or plant in the xylem. Okay, so it's moving up there, and the reason it's moving up there is because as the tree is carrying out photosynthesis, water evaporates. And when the water evaporates from the leaves through the stomates, salts get left behind here in the spongy layer. All right? So there's osmotic pressure now building up in the leaf because there's all this salt and minerals. So water naturally gets moving towards it through the veins, okay? Because osmosis is pulling that water, which is hydrogen bonded to other water and hydrogen bonded to the inside of the xylem, up to this area, okay? That's the pulling force that moves water up a plant. That can transport liters and liters of water a day for a big tree. And it costs the tree nothing. No plant expends any energy to move water. It's all done passively by osmosis. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, believe it or not, the tree expends zero energy to move water. Okay, there's no pump in the roots that's squishing and making the water go up. They don't have a heart or something like that. The water moves entirely passively up the tree because of this osmotic pressure that is set up at the top of the tree as water evaporates. Okay? As that water evaporates, carbon dioxide and oxygen are exchanged because photosynthesis is going on. What does photosynthesis produce? Sugar. All right. Now, obviously, the leaves are going to use some of the sugar that they use, okay, or that they make, sorry, but some of it's got to be transported to the, what part of the tree can't make water for, or can't make sugar for itself? The roots. So the sugar goes down the tree in a different set of tubes called the phloem. Okay? So the phloem transports sugar. So there's actually two kinds of sap in a tree. There's the sticky sap that you're probably familiar with. That's phloem sap. That's got sugars in it. If you were making maple syrup, okay, you would be tapping that part of the tree and harvesting that sugary sap from the maple tree. Okay? And then there's xylem sap, which is very thin because it's mostly water. That goes up the inside. Okay? So the xylem is on the inside of the stem, and the phloem is on the outside of the stem. Okay? So the phloem transports sugar down the tree. The xylem transports water up the tree. Both of those processes are free. Okay? The xylem uses osmosis and the polar nature of water, and the phloem, what do you suppose the phloem uses to move sugar? Gravity. Yeah, it's free and it works and it always pulls you down. Okay? So it's perfectly natural for the plant to use that because it's entirely reliable. All right. So this is the stuff you have in your notes. Okay, it's the numbers that go along with that list. Okay, so roots absorb the water. Okay, roots exchange gases. Water and minerals are transported upward as xylem sap within the xylem. Okay, transpiration. Okay, which is evaporation of water from the leaves. Okay, creates a force within the leaves that pulls the xylem sap upwards, and we want to add to that that force is osmotic pressure. Okay, so add that term to your notes. Okay. Okay, and then 6 and 7 talk about the sugar being produced and the sugar being transported in the phloem. Okay, so sugar is transported within the phloem, and you can add to your notes that is done by the force of gravity. Okay, will I put a question about that on your unit exam? It's out of 6 marks. Spoiler alert, it's on the test, that's 6 marks. Okay? Xylem, water, up, osmotic pressure, phloem, sugar, down, gravity. Okay? Like that's what you need to remember. Okay, in terms of the plant being able to transport materials. Okay? All right, so this is kind of what it looks like. You got the phloem on the outside, the xylem on the inside. The xylem is actually old phloem. When a tree or any plant grows, it thickens. It's always growing new phloem on the outside. So the phloem is actually living. The xylem is actually dead. Okay, so it's old phloem cells. Okay, and it works perfectly good to transport water. Okay, and the phloem is the living part. That's why when you hit the outside of a tree or it gets nicked or something like that, that sap comes out. It's the phloem that's on the outside. Okay, you can actually use that if you ever need to kill a tree. Let's say secretively. That's never happened. I've never had to kill a tree secretively. So you can ring a tree. All that means is you just cut around, don't cut it down because that's obvious. Okay? But if you want it to die secretly, okay, use a very thin cable saw. basically just a little piece of like metal wire, okay? And just go around the tree like this and cut in about that far. And that will rupture the phloem and the sap will leak out and it won't get to the roots. And then what will happen to the roots? They'll die because they'll starve. And then the tree will die. But no one will know because it's very hard to see that little cut in the tree. Okay? I never told you this. Oh, shoot, they recorded it. Anyway, yeah, so that would be a thing. It's obviously what can happen if a beaver, like that's why trees die. If a beaver doesn't take the tree down completely, the tree dies because the beaver goes all the way around it, okay? And it cuts off the phloem and the tree will fall over. Okay, we will talk more about that stuff tomorrow before we go over to the lab. Okay, so we got our lab tomorrow, okay, and we'll talk a little bit about the xylem and stuff before we go over there.